tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
I think the general sense here, when we talk about Volkswagen, Stellantis, all of this, is that in general, corporate welfare is not a winning proposition. Canadian taxpayers, Canadian workers really don't benefit from this. It becomes a race to the bottom. It's the big multinational companies that are the ones cashing the checks here. But in this case, it really is adding insult to injury when it's not even Canadian jobs that are ostensibly being created here. Aaron Wudrick is the domestic policy guru over at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and joins us now. Aaron, always good to talk to you. I mean, this is like really a slap in the face, but I'm almost glad because it shows more ostentatiously how bad corporate welfare is.
Yeah, look, for those who are tuning in who don't know my history on this, I've been a long-time critic of corporate welfare in all sectors, in all places, at all times. I'm a big fan of free enterprise and business and the right to earn a living and make money if you can, but you should not be getting tax dollars if your business cannot support itself, and that's especially true of these large multinationals. Andrew, in this case in particular, what I had a bit of a chuckle about is that, these are the same people, whenever I make my usual objections, they say, well, that's just the price we have to pay. We have to pay to play. If we want to get this plant, we just have to outlay these billions of dollars. That's just the way it is. But if you say, oh, some of that outlay has to go to, say the South Koreans want to bring in some experts from Seoul because they're the only ones who can do this. Oh, no, we can't have that. That's not a price we're willing to pay. We're willing to throw billions of dollars at something that makes no economic sense, but God forbid some of those workers come from outside of Canada. So I thought that was a little bit rich, but it does expose the absurdity of the whole thing. And frankly, it's just another reason why governments should not get their fingers into these business, right? Like if a business brings in foreign workers and they're paying it on their dime, it's kind of none of our business. But once our money is engaged, once taxpayer money is engaged, you've got the government going in there saying, well, you have to put the plant here and you have to have this many employees and you have to produce this. I mean, the government is basically running the company. And then you start to wonder, for people who know, well, government runs itself, imagine how good a job they're going to do running a business like Stellantis.
Yeah, and I think Pierre Poilievre made a point there, which is a valid one. I mean, South Korea, I don't know much about their domestic politics, but I suspect they're not giving companies large bailouts to bring in Canadian workers, nor should they. So I don't really see the argument here on how Canada should be doing this. I mean, TFWs are already a bit contentious. I mean, the argument is that, well, they only exist because there are jobs that Canadians just can't do or more specifically won't do. In this particular case, when companies are given money that governments are turning around and defending by saying it's going to create Canadian jobs and it's creating South Korean jobs, it just doesn't really square there.
No, look, and when it comes to importing workers to do work in this country, they generally fall into one of two buckets, right? You have people who are very, very rare skills that are highly skilled that we just don't have enough of those people on the high end. And then also what we call on the low skill end. So you've got work that Canadians don't want to do. It doesn't pay very well. It's very hard. So those are the two sort of high end and low end. Now, on the high end, if you're in a, you're looking for nuclear physicists, right? There's just not that many. There's not that much you can do, but that's not very many jobs. On the low end, the challenge we have is employers say, well, we can't find any workers even if we raise our wages. In some cases that's true, but my response there is, well, what kind of entitlements is the government offering that will keep people out of these jobs? I mean, the reality is if we live in a country where the social safety net is so comfortable that you can actually choose to work or not, and I'm not saying all people do this. Of course, some people can't work and have legitimate reasons not to work, but especially in certain regions of this country, it's well established that there are people that are prepared to work less or work part of the year because the entitlement system is so generous. So my argument is if you actually make that entitlement system a little bit less generous, create some better incentives for people to work, you'll have more people going into those jobs. You'll have less need for temporary foreign workers, and this problem largely goes away.
Yeah, and I hate to keep beating people over the head with the obvious point here, but there is a difference between a company that says, look, we have this need, we believe it can be best filled or only filled by foreign workers in this market, and a company that does that, well, the government is paying for it.
Well, exactly. We're paying for the privilege, and if a business wants to do that sort of thing, boy, they should be running as far away as they can from any handout, because obviously this objection, and politicians are right. I mean, at least in this instance, you have governments now saying, well, we want to make sure the taxpayer money is well spent on a subsidy in a different way. But nonetheless, I mean, you can see how any politician worth their salt is going to see the alarm ringing here, saying this is not going to go over well with anybody if this money is actually leaving the country.
Outside of this, I wanted to get you on the show anyway today. You had a great piece in the Globe and Mail. The key to saving Canada's economy is tax reform. Now, I think it's safe to say in the last 8 years, no one in government has come up with a key to saving Canada's economy. So I think as a Canadian, I say thank you for putting this up there. But when you say tax reform, I mean, we often hear governments and political parties talk about, oh, we can, add this little tax credit here, this reduction. In some cases, even more radical reforms like what Stephen Harper did in reducing the GST. But when you talk about tax reform, you're talking about something a bit more radical here. Explain.
Yeah, I'd say too the title's a little bit generous. I argue that tax reform's a key plank in boosting our economy. It's not the only one. That alone's not going to do it. I would
Mhm.
say, Andrew, generally the debate over taxes is about higher or lower, and I think that's an important debate. I come down firmly on the lower side of that, but that's a separate debate than a complex system. We have an absurdly complicated tax system. Most people who have to do their taxes know this. Don't even try doing it without a professional help or without one of those softwares that you purchase. It's way too complicated. There's a cost to that. It distorts the system. It's confusing. It makes it hard for businesses to comply. I think it's fair to say we should have a debate about how much money does the government need, and then we got to look at the fairest, simplest, most neutral way to raise that money. And that's part of the thing that often gets left out when we're debating higher or lower taxes is which taxes are the ones that are the best to get this money, which ones are going to create the least distortions and do the least damage to our economy.
One of the biggest problems with taxes, in my view, well, paying them, but one of the other biggest problems, and this is true in Canada, it's especially true in the United States, is that we have such a path dependency in our approach to taxes. If you were to say,
Mhm.
we're going to gather around a group of people and we're going to create a new tax system from scratch, that starting from zero, no assumptions previously, I don't think anyone would land on what we have. I don't think anyone would come up with a tax code that is just this long, in the US even longer, because it doesn't make sense and because it's so complex and convoluted. Yet this is what we have, and as a
Mhm.
result, changes seem to be very limited to tweaks and like you say, higher or lower. So would you, in the ideal world, if you were at that table, would you be changing something fundamental in how much you rely on consumption, how much you rely on corporate, how much you rely on sales and income? Like, what would your approach be if you were to really blow this up and start from scratch?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right. It's a bit like barnacles on the hull of a ship, right? They just keep clinging on and eventually you drag the ship down with you. There's an inertia element to that, right? Politicians have limited political capital. They don't want to waste all their time sort of undoing or fixing the things their predecessors done. They want to get on with their own. So they just end up layering it on top of things. Look, I think there's a good debate to be had about the role of consumption taxes. People don't like them because they can see them. So they're kind of economically efficient, but they are very, very politically damaging. We saw that with the GST in this country. We've seen it with things like carbon taxes. The other problem with consumption taxes is rarely are they applied consistently. See, like you'll bring in something like a GST or a carbon tax, and then you'll get all these little carve outs, right? Well, we won't tax poor people, and we won't tax pregnant mothers, and we won't tax this product, and so you kind of undermine the purpose of the consumption
Well, and,
tax
and just
in the
just
first
to
place.
interject there for a moment,
Mhm.
and then you get these really convoluted debates about what a food product is. Things like, well, this is a grocery product, but this is a snack product, so it's not even
Yeah.
consistent within a category.
Yeah, so I would say, generally speaking, whether if you're going to do consumption taxes, just do it blanket. Don't have all these carve outs because otherwise you're just undermining the additional value of that. The other debate is over the taxing things like land and housing. Some people are pushing for things like a home equity tax. You can imagine how that's probably about as popular as a snowfall in July. But I think another thing we need to really wrap our heads around, and this is another political challenge, is this idea of when we talk about taxing businesses. People love taxing big corporations, right? People forget that corporations are a legal fiction. There is no thing called a corporation paying tax in reality. Someone else is paying that tax. It's the employees of the company, it's the shareholders of the company, it's the customers of the company. So somebody else somewhere is paying that tax. So, it's very popular politically to say we should tax, corporate tax, raise it. That doesn't hurt anybody. Well, it actually does. Somebody else is paying that tax. And in a lot of cases, it's better to just tax people on their personal income tax than it is through, if a very well, say you want to get a very wealthy person to pay more tax, don't tax the business they own more, just tax above a certain threshold, their income higher. That's the better way to go about that. Coming back to that whole figure out how much you want to raise and then figure out the least sort of distorting way to raise it.
Well, and to put that into the context of our corporate welfare discussion, I mean, I imagine if a government could say to a company, we're going to give you $0 in corporate welfare, but we're going to charge you 0% corporate tax
Mhm.
because we know that you're going to employ all these people who are going to pay corporate tax and your executives are going to pay income tax rather. And that there's, I don't know how much money that works out to because it depends on the company, but there's a
Sure.
very real chance that that would give them more than
Yeah.
corporate welfare does. And it's an incentive that doesn't cost taxpayers money.
Right. Well, look, and incentives matter, right? I've often gone to these debates about people say, well, you support tax cuts. Isn't that the same as corporate welfare, right? I mean, you're giving the company money. And my response is pretty straightforward, right? There's a big difference between if you run a business and you earn money, that's your money, and you get to keep more of it, right? That's money you had to go out and earn in the marketplace. That's different than the government coming along and saying, we're just going to sprinkle this money on you. You just get this money whether you sell stuff or not.
And
I
only
think
to
that's
some companies, whereas
well,
the tax
exactly.
thing is across the board.
That's where the fairness thing comes in. But I mean, just conceptually, they're very different. For you to believe that a tax cut is the same as corporate welfare requires you to believe it's actually the government's money in the first place,
Hmm.
right? And they're just letting you keep some of it. So I find that we can debate. I'm not a big fan of boutique tax cuts either. I think you should treat all businesses equally. You shouldn't sort of single different ones out. But letting people keep more of their own money is a very different thing than giving them a bunch of money that was never theirs in the first place.
Well, and this is where we get to, I think, the biggest issue here. And I realize that you're in a very good position on this because you work in policy. But the politics and the policy of taxes and economics, I think, are oftentimes in direct conflict. And this is,
Yeah.
I mean, we can talk about the Liberal government's financial mismanagement, but I think the Conservatives are particularly bad historically at wanting to embrace these boutique tax cuts because it's very good politics. If you can say to a single mom, we're going to do this for you, or if you can say to a family with kids in sports, we're going to give you this money for your kids to do sports. But then what you've done is you've added more and more complexity, more carve outs, and less universality to the tax system.
Absolutely. And you saw this argument during the conservative years under Stephen Harper. They added a lot of boutiques credits. And who's going to argue with that? Who's going to argue with the idea that, giving families a tax credit to put their kids in sports is a bad thing? The problem is what I found ironic was that people at the time argued that, well, if we just cut income taxes, the Liberals would come along and reverse that. Whereas if we put these little things in the tax code for the reasons we talked about earlier, they'll stay there. What ended up happening, ironically, as Justin Trudeau comes into office, one of the first and best things he did, in my view, was he got rid of those credits and he actually just cut taxes. So it's been a long time since early 2016 when he did those great tax measures, Andrew. But I do remember back in the distant history that there was actually a couple of good tax policies under Justin Trudeau.
But then your fiscal honeymoon ended when he still continued to ramp up spending for the next 8 years.
Yeah, it
despite
ended pretty
that nominal
fast.
tax cut. And
Yeah.
well, I hope that the Aaron Wudrick vision finds a home in someone who's in a position to put it there where it needs to be on the books. Aaron Wudrick from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Great piece in the Globe and Mail. And thanks as always for coming on today.
Thanks a lot, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.